Where did we leave off last week? Session 21, I believe.
We just went over a lot of passages, and now you will sabi mo we will go to 22 settings. 19, yeah, 19 was the last. I think we look at ano passage to? What did we look?
Mm-hmm.
What passage did we? Ano?
Cain and Abel.
Okay, and Abel. Yeah, we went Cain and Abel.
All right, so we're going to just get started here. So it's actually session 22. Okay, we're in session 22. So here's, I'm going to ask a question that will sort of get us in the right headspace and hopefully synthesize what we talked about last. So the reflection question I have for you guys, if you want to write this down, and I'll give us a little bit of time to think about it. Why might the narrator leave ambiguities in characterization? What is the effect of creating complex characters or leaving gaps? That might be the key question of 21. Okay, why might the narrator, what's the question?
Leave ambiguities in characterization.
Mm-hmm. And what's the effect of gaps, of creating complex characters or leaving gaps? Just a few moments to think about that. Why might the narrator leave ambiguities in characterization? And what is the effect of creating complex characters or leaving gaps?
So that the readers will be able to, in order to bring an adequate attentiveness to the readers.
Yeah, it's an invitation to dig deeper. Authors of biblical narratives are often not spelling things out for you. Instead, they leave intentional space for you as the reader to fill gaps in with things you may have already assumed. And then it's essentially, so the rabbis would call this, they have a term for it in Hebrew, but the sense is that as a reader, as you hear the story, you try on a different interpretation as you read. And if it squares with what the story is, then it's worth thinking about. It's worth pondering. This is how they encourage the growth in wisdom. So there may be things like the significance of locations where things are happening, or things that are simply inferred by the outcome of a character's actions. For example, we aren't explicitly told that the practice of polygamy is bad, which was engaged in by many prominent biblical figures. But we see the destruction that it leaves in the wake of those who practice it, right? Where it's not explicitly said that polygamy is a no-no, you can interpret some passages to be explicit, but right, they're ambiguous. But really, we see the result. Any other thoughts about this? What the effect of literary gaps are, or complex characters, or ambiguity?
I think it will give us to be more intentional in our reading rather than to just gloss over it.
Mm-hmm.
So it invites you to pay attention and to be more aware of what's going on. Like for example, what's the significance of Esau is hairy? I mean, there's some things the way they describe biblical characters.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you just gloss over it, but then in the end, as you go and
Yeah.
read further, right?
Yeah.
That is where
Yeah.
you find the connection between that description and like for example, Saul and David. Saul was described as handsome and tall, and yet when Samuel was trying to find who would be the next king as the son of Jesse, as God told him to go, his first intent was the firstborn. He didn't even consider the youngest.
Mm-hmm.
And yet God said, I look at the heart, not on stature. So probably that is something
Yeah.
that's very significant.
Yeah. Oftentimes, through characters, the biblical author's worldview is communicated through how they describe the characters and how they portray certain settings, including what is said and what is not emphasized. The narrative's ethical dimensions are evidenced by the characters' decisions. So you see the decisions they make, and the author leaves it up to you all to evaluate it. Creating complex characters while leaving gaps affects the reader by holding up essentially a mirror with which you experience the narrative. And whatever strikes you at that moment is worth interrogating, right? Any other things? I'm especially interested in hearing from people who are always here. One more. I'll read the question again. Why might the narrator leave ambiguities in characterization? What is the effect of creating complex characters or leaving gaps?
It will be a never-ending question of why did God do that?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah, so what's the effect? I think this is a more personal question. What's the effect of creating complex characters or leaving gaps? You'll get more ideas. Yeah. Yeah.
Our habit in terms of reading the scripture will change.
Yes, this is important. Oh, yeah, Joe.
Sometimes it helps to make the reader think about other things besides, like if the character is doing something good or bad, this gives you the events for you to
Yeah.
think about, are they doing this for more?
Sure. Yeah, I think all of these things kind of zoom in on similar ideas. So talking about how creating a complex character while leaving a gap, like we said, is already an invitation to read deeply or with more intention, but then also it invites multiple perspectives, right? And then depending on your perspective, your read of very vague or ambiguous story or little section of story will be very different, right? Like somebody who reads the story of David and Bathsheba from a place of deep sexual trauma in their past will come to that story very differently than somebody who has never experienced that or is a perpetrator of such things, right? Like those readings are valuable to us, and that's what it invites us to do, is to enter dialogue with one another as a community as we try and read the scriptures, right? So the invitation that complex characters and ambiguous stories is to dig deeper as a community, but also to ask yourself and ask better questions. Welcome. Without further ado, we'll go to our next session, right? But I'm just going to have a couple questions really quick. So, in this section, so we're in session 22. We're turning a corner. We're going to close things out here, right? So, but we've completed this section, right? This unit 3. So, what we've learned about the 3 main components of narrative. What are the 3 main components of narrative? We spent a lot of time here. We've talked a good amount of the very first one, which was, it's where I had the graph, right? If you remember, the main thing with narrative is that it's not historical, it's what? You can also just say things that you think are important with narratives. It doesn't have to be the 3 I gave you. The first one is very obvious. Every narrative needs a plot. That's the first one, right? So all narratives have plot or storyline. Right? So like if we're talking about session 2, right? Unit 2, we talked about poetry. What's the important things in poetry? Repeated words, right? Form, right? Parallelism. Those are the 3 important things for any poetic narrative. I mean, any form of poetry in Hebrew poetry. For narrative, we have a couple things that are important. So plot and storyline is the first one.
Then there'll be escalation.
Yeah, so escalation, all those things, climax, those are all part of plot, right? That's all under plot. But we also learned about the actors who participate in the plot. What are those called? Characters, right? So in every good narrative has characters that experience the plot, right? And then setting, right? Those are the 3 main things. Setting, characterization, and plot are the 3 main things to keep an eye out for when you're looking at narrative. So, for example, what's the setting of the story of Moses? What's the setting of the story of Moses? There's a lot of them, right? There's a lot throughout Moses' story. Name some of them. Okay, the river is one. So the Nile. Okay, Egypt as a grand setting, but then the Nile is one. Right? Why is the Nile an important setting? Yeah. So now let's practice this. So think of the Nile. So the river story of Moses, right? That in its own, as a structure, has a plot arc. He's in the water. It's dangerous. Why did he go into the water? Because they're being killed, right? The babies are being killed. So that's the initial incident. And so now the conflict is, how is he going to get out of the water, right? That's the problem that needs to get solved. And
There's a subplot.
what's the subplot?
It happened to be the daughter of Pharaoh.
Well, the subplot is Miriam was following close by, right? So we have two plots now.
Yeah, looking at
Miriam following ahead, and that's how you get to the resolution, right? Which is being found in the king's court, right? And Moses is picked up, right? But this is an interesting one. So we have characters like Moses, right? We have characters like Miriam, right? The Pharaoh's court, right? Pharaoh's court. Can you think of any other characters that are important here? You have to think creatively now, right? Now we're doing critical literary theory, right? It's not just the most obvious ones.
just the Nile, right?
The Nile is like this, it's setting, right? The Nile is a setting, but you could make an argument that it is also a character, right? People,
This is just what we're talking
this is just a Nile story, right?
about. The Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah, Pharaoh's,
Pharaoh's
yeah,
or daughter or whatever.
daughter, court, yeah, whatever. But then we have the Nile as the setting. Whoops. Nile is setting, right? What's another character? This one's creative.
The mother became
Yeah,
the nanny.
yeah. Yocheved became the nanny, right, or the midwife. But then also, the Pharaoh himself, not just the court, right? But then this one is a little bit. You have to get a little creative here. This one really helps to see if you know the Hebrew word. But if you don't know the Hebrew word, then you might miss this character. So this is it's a trick question because you have to get creative. It's not a character in the sense that it's Moses or Pharaoh or Yocheved or Miriam, but you have a character here. It's the ark. And you don't know that it's the ark, but the word ark here is the same word used for the basket. So this is a repeated character, right? So the setting's important. Why? Why is the setting important? What does it remind you of? An ark in dangerous waters. Noah's ark. It's the flood. It's intentionally placed on analogy. So this is what we talked about, echoes, right? Echoes, or we talked about the silhouette. So we have a silhouette, and what's the silhouette? What's the initial thing? Yeah, what's the background, right? And then every other story that appears like this has that as its first background. So what's the first silhouette of the ark story? This is also a trick question, because it's not the ark. Right? This is the trick question. It's not the ark. The first time that you have something coming through chaos waters is not the ark.
It's in the garden.
It's in the garden. It's actually dry land. Dry land, right? It's the dry land that emerges from the waters, right? And so there's a relationship already from the very beginning. The earth was formless and void, right? It's tohu, it's watery and waste, right? It's deep and the Spirit is hovering over. And only when the waters are separated, waters above from waters below, can the dry land emerge. And then the dry land emerging is what? What happens because of dry land? Life. Humans can exist. Animals can exist, right? Adam, humanity, and Eva, life, can exist because dry land appears when God separates the waters, right? And that's the very first time. So dry land means lots of things: life, presence with God, plants, flourishing, humanity, right? So that's the image. So the very first thing is the darkness. The dark waters are parted, and then dry land emerges, right? And then dry land, it shows us what? There's the heavens above, the waters below, and then the dry land that's safe. The ark is intentionally put on parallel with the creation story, right? If you look at it, there's three chiasms, right? It's complicated, but this is how narratives work. That's a complex subplot, is that you have the flood descending and it's a reversal of the creation. piece by piece. It goes backwards from creation. So it's like when the ark happen, when the waters begin to run, it's like the uncreation of the world, right? And now the earth is back to formless and void. But there's something. There's an ark with 3 levels, right? It's 3 levels, right? Waters above, waters below, and then the ark that keeps all of creation in there, in miniature, right? And it is brought forth, right, through the water. Like being brought through the water as a form of salvation, that's the silhouette, right? Deliverance for mankind is the separating of the waters and the appearance of dry land. In the Noah story, dry land also emerges, the peaks of the mountains, right? So this is important. The ark rests on top, right? And so what we have here is our first silhouette, right? The first silhouette of this Moses story. And you could say that Moses is like the miniature version of the Genesis narrative. Everything so far, Exodus retells it, right? In the Nile story, right? It's important, right? So this is where it really pays off to know how plots are set up, how setting is set up. And this is just a miniature, right? This is just a couple verses, actually, with its own plot structure, embedded in a larger plot structure. Where does Moses end up going? Into the desert, right? Which is the Genesis 2 story, right? In Genesis 1, the wasteland that is not inhospitable for humanity is water. It's an ocean, right? But in Genesis 2, there's a second creation story, right? It's like a retelling of the same story. But instead of a watery wasteland, it's a wilderness that there are no plants, right? And so you have a lot of things going on at once, right? And so learning to identify plot, setting, and character, something as creative as ark, is important, right? It's good, right? So it's only used twice, basket and ark. So here's another one. Here are the opening 2 verses of the book of Ruth, right? So I'm going to read it to you. You can go to the book Ruth, and I'm going to ask some questions, right? I'm going to give you a minute, but read the first 2 verses of Ruth. And then I want you to take note of the words having to do with setting, right? So do that. I'm going to. All right, there are two words having to do with setting, specifically time. Time is also a setting, right? It's not just place, right? So Ruth 1, verses 1 and 2. Okay. What are the two phrases or words that have to do with setting, specifically time? Because setting shapes the way the story will go. It shapes what's possible for the plot, right? What's the first one? In the days when the judges governed. What does this tell us? What does this tell us? What does it tell us about the story? What does it tell us about the author? Right? This is just literary criticism. Anybody can do this. Anybody with an English degree or has taken some classes can do this. In the days when the judges governed.
So the setting is during the reign of the judges.
Yeah. The Yeah, so the author is reporting to us some story that they had received, right? So the author is looking back, right, at some time. Whether or not this story took place is irrelevant, right? It's irrelevant to the author's point. The author is going to make some claims. It's going to tell a story for you, right? So this is the distinction we were making before, that historicity actually is beside the point to any narrative. Right? Unless the narrative is trying to get you to, it really happened, so believe this, right? It's beside the point. So here we are. It came about in the days when the judges governed, so we have that the author is looking back. It's a story about way back when, right? During the time of the judges, which gives you the time frame. It gives you what's possible. So the judges are ruling. If the judges are ruling, what is there not? There's no king, right? There's no king, right? But it also means that there's no consolidated kingdoms yet. There's still tribes, right? And then what else is true? They have just received the promised land. It's at some, right? The time of the judges is long, right? It's the time from they enter the promised land to the time where till they got the king. So it's a nondescript point of time. And what was the time of receiving the promised land like? It was conquest, right? Conquest. They're taking land from people who already live there, right? So there's conflict, right? Which we get that here. So what else? What's another setting?
The famine. There was a famine.
Yeah, there was a famine in the land. Why is that a setting?
Yeah, it will, yeah. I think this particular story
Has to do with food at the end, right?
has something to do with that famine. There may be other famine, but
Yeah,
they were talking
yeah,
about this particular famine.
exactly. So so it's a lean time. And so but let's also get away from during that time, that phrase in particular. In the story, there's a famine, and everything takes place as a result of the famine. So you could call the initial event the famine, right? The famine is where it begins. It's why Ruth and Naomi move, right? This is the setting. It sets the plot line's boundaries, but it also will influence what will be important.
One other thing that is observable is that, at least in this time of that particular story that happened, it seems as though that Israel and Moab are okay,
Yes.
because they were enemies in Israel and Moab. But in this time,
Yeah.
you can, like for example, now we can go to, like for example, in the time of King Jairus,
Yeah.
Grandpa went to Iran, I believe,
Yeah.
something like
Sure. Yeah. So what we have here is it tells us a little bit about Moab. But Moab is a character, right? Moab in this particular story is a character, right? And he already displayed some knowledge of what the character symbolizes. Moab, for the people who would have been reading this, that's historically, we don't get along, right? And Ruth, our main character, is a Moabite, right? So that already sets boundaries, right? It's the main character of this particular story is typically an enemy of the people who would be reading it, right? So that sets an ethical message. It's a trajectory. Is Ruth going to be what we'd expect? Torn down, made fun of? We call her stupid or dirty? Or does the author have good things to say about Ruth, right? So this is the way that the narrative is going to work. It's going to actually challenge perception, right? If I was an Israelite reading this story, I might not like Ruth, right? Ruth would not be a good person to me. I have some misgivings about Ruth to begin with, right? For us as the 21st century readers, we don't have the baggage that readers of this or listeners of this would have had with a character named Ruth, right? So this prepares us for the story what to expect, right? So these settings and these characters already shape the way that it shapes the story, right? And so we've observed that the story is set in the time of the judges and during a famine. What mood does that set for the story? Hard times. If you're familiar with the book of Judges, the entire book is chaotic. It's violent. It's depressing, right? The historically, commentators on the book on the Hebrew Bible didn't like Judges because of how violent it was and how almost irredeemable things are, right? It spirals into worse, right? At the beginning, Israel is more or less still in their tribes, but by the end, it's a civil war, right? And it's not good, right? And so, what other things? What else? What other mood is there? Time of famine. Right? The story is set in the time of Judges during a famine in the land. And land, this phrase, the land. Okay? This is another character. Right? Where's the first time the character of the land shows up? We talked about it. Creation. It appears. Right? It appears. That character appears. The land. Right? And then where are Adam and Eve kicked from? The land. What is the land that will be futile for them, right? Now the ground is cursed, and you'll have to fight for, right? So the land is a character, right? There's the taking of the promised land. There's the loss of land. There's right splitting of the land. This is important, but also land can represent what? Dry land, salvation from the waters. In Paul, the land is groaning, right? The eretz is groaning under pains of childbirth, right? So we have a character. So, but the land typically in these stories refers to Israel, Judah, right? A famine definitely sets the story in a difficult time, right? The setting is difficult, and it creates a question about people are struggling to survive. And ultimately, Ruth's story is a story about how she's going to survive in a hostile land, right? Because she's a Moabite in a land that does not love her, with a woman to whom she has no allegiance, right? She just loves Naomi, right? And in fact, if you did a study of the word famine, you'll find that famine is, if you went on Bible Gateway and studied famine, you'll find that famine usually sets characters up for a very hard time, right? But in a hard time in the sense that they usually make unwise decisions during famine. During the famine is when Joseph almost kills his brother, right? During the famine in Egypt, right? He almost has Benjamin and Reuben done away with, right? So you'll find that if you study the word famine, it often leads characters to unwise decisions. If you know the story of the Hebrew Bible, when you hear this famine, I'm expecting Ruth to do some very unwise things, right? And that's the tension of the story is that, wow, she's actually not doing unwise things, right? So additionally, in the time of the judges, it creates a somber mood because as we've talked about, the judges is not a good time for Israel, right? It's not just a time of increased violence, no king, and lawlessness. It was a time where Israel really broke apart at the seams, right? You'll find that it was a time where the author of Judges will say everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king in Israel, right? And so it's a significant phrase that gets repeated out through the book, is in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is a repeated phrase, right? In that phrase, eyes is a character, right? Because you have a word that, from the very beginning in Genesis, he saw what was good, right? And then the fundamental failing in Genesis 3, is that they saw something that was not good as good, right? Something that is not tov as tov. So, right? I saw it, and I saw that it was good, even though it was not good, right? That's the thing that they fail at. And in Judges, it's the same, but all over the place. Nowhere in Israel was there a king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? So that's a silhouette again, right? So this is the opposite of doing what is good in God's eyes, right? What God sees as good is what we do. So somber mood in Judges, the land. So we've collected the information on the beginning of Ruth. Let's make sure we're on the same page. The author uses the setting of Ruth to communicate the story that takes place during one of the darkest times in Israel's history. True or false? The author uses the setting of Ruth to communicate the story takes place during one of the darkest times in Israel's history. True. Right? So whoever shows up in the story of Ruth, if Judges is the setting, we can expect that no one will do what is right in God's eyes, right? Right? Every Israelite will not do that, except Ruth the Moabite, right? She will be the wise woman here. It also helps that in the original, in the order of Scripture that I gave you, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, Ruth follows Proverbs, right? The virtuous woman, right? And then Ruth, character. Right? That's intentional design. Yeah, Bethlehem is also important. Right? So the author uses this. Right? So location. So time is one aspect of the setting. Time of the judges, the time of famine. Place is another. So look, Ruth 1 and 2. What are the places? We're looking for 5. Right? Uh-huh. Yeah, so the land, Bethlehem in Judah, land of Moab, Bethlehem in Judah, the land of Moab, right? So we'll look at the individual components of this setting so that we can discover how the author is intending them to affect the story, because they're being mentioned, right? The author could have just said, if it was just about anywhere, they could have just said the characters' names. There's a famine, right? But they're mentioning place names. So these are characters as well, place settings, right? So what is the land in verse 1 referring to?
Bethlehem.
No.
The land?
Yeah.
That is the Judah part of
Yeah. Israel and Judah, so Israel and Judah is also, if you know the story, it's Canaan, right? Right? The land that was promised to Abraham in Genesis 12, right? 1 through 3. This is the phrase, the land, right? The land that Abraham said, you're going to give me land? You haven't even given me the son, right? How can I trust you, right? So that's the moment, right? It begins in Genesis 12. So now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and your relatives and from your father's house to the land. It's Canaan, right? And I'll make you a great nation. So the land represents what? The blessing of Abraham. And the blessing of Abraham is what? If we go back to our first lessons, it's that this project of humanity be set back on track, right? The blessing of Abraham is not just to bless some random family, but so that Adam, the gift of Adam, or the blessing of Adam, is restored to humanity, right? Abraham's just the vessel in which that happens, right? So the land has a lot of associations, and the blessing is one of them, right? Okay. Next question. What kind of land is Moab portrayed to be like in the biblical story?
So there is famine, so there is plenty.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's how, because they left the land and they left Bethlehem, which is ironically means house of bread or food, but they cannot find food because there is famine. Now they go to Moab, which probably
Okay.
have food.
Sure. Okay. So now in the story itself, we have they left because Moab had famine, right? So represented a place where they had to leave. But in the entirety of the biblical story, not just Ruth, right? We already said some of this. It's an enemy nation of Israel and Judah. It's an antagonist to the land, right? It's dangerous. Even in Exodus, right? When they cross the Red Sea, and then now they're walking in the plains of Moab, and the king of Moab is watching, right? And he sends a prophet, Balaam and Balak, to pronounce curses, but Balak can only say blessings, right? So that's one, the enemy nation of Judah. But here's one that I don't think you'll get. There's a second identity of the character of Moab. Right? So in Israelite history, Moabites are some of the strongest enemy nations for Israel, right? They constantly lead the people into idolatry and fight against them. So the Moabites are getting Israelites to follow their gods, but at the same time they're fighting, right? But there's another character identity for Moab that almost nobody thinks about when they think about Moab unless you've studied it. But now you guys will know. What's the silhouette for Moab? Okay, Egypt is close. But technically they're part of the blessing, right? They're just not the one through whom the blessing will come. The blessing will be given to them through Abraham, right? So whatever promises are there, that's why in Ephesians he says, right, now you're inheritors of the blessing, because the thing that we tried to do is done, right? It's back. But there's this origin story for the character of Moab. It's in Genesis 19, and almost nobody knew that. Genesis 19, 30 to 38. It's meant to characterize them very negatively. In that story, Abraham's nephew Lot is tricked into being intoxicated. He gets drunk, right? His daughters get him drunk, who then they sleep with him and they carry on their family line. And one of their kids' names is Moab, right? Out of this story is, why did you bring Lot? I told you to leave your family. Why did you bring Lot? Right? So that's the question, is that Abraham is told by God, go leave your father's country and go to the land I will give you. Leave everything. But he brought his nephew. The next sentence is he brought his nephew Lot. And the author doesn't evaluate that for us. As a reader, we're just supposed to be like, wait, I thought you were not supposed to do that, right? And we don't see what will happen until the story continues and shows us what happens. And so you have Lot being tricked into carrying siring this child, Moab, right? Moab and Ammon, the Ammonites, right? They're children of incest. And it's a very negative character. It's a very negative portrayal of Lot and also the decision of Abraham. So the people who end up biting Israel are their relatives, right? Long in the past, right? And so when you hear the passage about, and the sins of the fathers will be visited, right? On the third and fourth generation, you have it here. There it is. Ammon and Moab, right? So that's the second character. Every time you see Moab, that initial failure of Abraham is multiplying, right? And so you have that sense of the same thing that happens in the flood narrative, right? What's the commission of Adam and Eve? What are they supposed to do?
To subdue the earth and then multiply.
Yeah, be fruitful and multiply, right? And then the tragedy in Genesis is that they have multiplied and they've filled the land. They were fruitful, but what did they fill it with? Violence, right? And that's the twist of the knife there. That's the author is saying that when you do this, it multiplies into all kinds of things, right? The Lord is still here, right? He's still with you, but there's Moab now. Now there's Ammon, right? And so that's it. Another setting that's mentioned is, so we talked about Moab, we talked about the land. Bethlehem in Judah. So what is that? Is that part of the promised land or part of Moab?
Part of the promised land.
Right? It's inside the land, right? So Bethlehem is a specific place inside the land, right? It is part of the promised land that was promised to Abraham in Genesis 12, right? Why would they get specific? Right? This is important, right? Like they're honing in on something. Because at this point, where is Ruth in the Tanakh? Where is Ruth in the Tanakh? Is it in Torah, Nevi'im, or Ketuvim?
It's in the writings.
It's in the writings, which means you've already read the Nevi'im. And what's in the Nevi'im? The story of David, the story of Bethlehem, right? You've already read it. So now it's actually getting you to remember, like, wow, through this family, God is faithful. Through the Moabites, through the very thing that has been biting you in the heels because of your fathers, your great-grandfather's grandfather's sin, right? It is how the deliverance is put in.
I just have a question. Do these Israelites now consider David the ancestor of David? What's the Moabite?
Yeah.
Do they acknowledge that?
It's so like,
Or the Messiah is a Moabite?
yeah, it's interesting, right? Because, yeah, exactly. That's a hard question to answer, right? So we've covered the opening of Ruth. Look at the next couple verses, 3 through 5, right? Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah. The name of the other was Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So what happens in the plot conflict? What happens? Does the plot conflict increase or decrease? In what way?
Yeah, so they left the place where they were and they went to, no.
Yeah, there's complication to say the least. Yeah.
They're supposed to start a family.
Yeah.
Instead of increasing, it decreased. So no man.
Yeah. So the plot conflict actually increases drastically. Not only was there a famine, but the very safety net for one of our main characters, Naomi, is gone. So not only is there a famine, which would have made it hard for any family to have secured food, but now she is a single, unmarried widow, right? In a time of famine. All of her legacy and her husband, right, has perished, right? So there are 3 deaths in this chapter. This may be the author's way of showing that going to Moab and integrating there in the first place was a bad move, right? Because in the story of Israel, Moabites represented a departure from the will of God, because that's what Lot was. God said, don't bring him. He brought him, right? And where did Lot want to go? He always wanted to park near Sodom, right? He didn't want to go with Abraham, right? Yeah, so it just was a challenge. So this may be the author's way of hinting that going to Moab in the first place was not a good idea, right? And integrating there and just becoming part of Moabite culture, because it's likely that it's likely that Naomi herself was fully Moabite, right? She had lived there for a while. Second, taking Moabite women as wives was also a no-no, because at the beginning of the end of the Ketuv, at the end of the Nevi'im, is the end of the Nevi'im is marriage reform, right? Why did you do that? Because the first reason that Solomon's kingdom broke was his willingness to take multiple women of all over the place, right? And so, well, we obviously can't have that, so we have to marriage reform, right? That's Nehemiah, right? So, because they are women from Moab, which is symbolically, right? Symbolically an enemy nation that has consistently led Israel to worship other gods, right? They're children of incest. Third, living there 10 years increases the tension, right? They were there for a long time, right? 10 years is a long time, right? That's the emphasis. Finally, the emphasis on Naomi being left and bereft. In Hebrew, so this is the English translators, they're trying to catch the wordplay, right? Left and bereft, right? Highlights the tensions as well. So as readers, we are listening to, oh man, what's going to happen now to Ruth or what's going to happen now to Naomi? At this point, I think that Naomi is the main character, right? What happens next? Right? The story continues to unfold. Verses 6 and 7. Then she, who is Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they were on their way to return to the land of Judah. Right? So what do you notice about plot and characterization of the women in the next 2 verses? What developed in the plot, and how are these characters characterized? Right? At this point, we're still left wondering what will happen to these women, right? But some of these verses show a positive movement, right, in the plot. And it resolves some of the conflict, because a woman with no one is dead in the water, right? Dead in the water, and she's old. It's Naomi, right? And but the women are on their way back to the land, which is good. You're leaving Moab, right? Now you're going back to the land that was promised, right? So this means that they were in the promised land and they left, right? And now they're coming back to the promised land. They're heading which direction? Back to the promised land, right? Yeah, and the women are on their way back to the land of Judah. So it characterizes the women who are Moabites positively, right? This is like, oh wow, I didn't expect that. Especially because they go in response to what? The word of the Lord. That's a character. Word of the Lord. Right? Where's the first time we see the word of the Lord? Genesis. Technically, we see it hovering over the face of the deep, right? The Spirit of God or the breath of God. But the breath of God springs forth as soon as let there be light, right? So you have a character already, word of the Lord, right? And so these women, they respond to the word of the Lord, right? They respond that the Lord has visited his people there. And so this characterizes what? What does it tell us about these women? There's some faithfulness. There's some idea that this matters, right? So there's positive movement. So this is just a simple practice on plot characterization and setting, right? We looked at how much is communicated simply by the plot setting in just a short number of verses. That's just 7 verses, and we were able to glean so much, right? And so we'll look at some of these patterns in upcoming sessions. So I'll just begin session 22 for us. We did the practice, and so I think we've driven home some of the points for plot, character, and setting. Any other thoughts before we move? So now we're at design patterns. Oops. Yeah. And literary units. So this is now where we looked at plot, setting, characters, and now we're going to talk about design patterns, so larger things, and then literary units, which are like blocks of like a chunk. A literary unit would be something like the flight from Egypt, right? Leaving Egypt, right? The wilderness wanderings is a literary unit, right? So we're going to talk about design. Any questions before we simply just start this off? So we're going to talk about design patterns and what I call hyperlinking, right? It's like when you're on Wikipedia and you see a blue word and you click it and it takes you to another web page. That's the way that I think that the Bible is having you think, that when they say Moab, you hyperlink to Genesis 19 and all the other stories that Moab appears, right? And how they're similar but different, right? And so we're going to be talking about hyperlinking and biblical narrative. In many ways, this represents the thing that I'm most excited about in real time, right? But in real time, we're going to be talking about some of the scholars that I found most interesting in the last 5 years, because this is cutting edge of biblical studies. But two analogies and two metaphors to set before that I'm going to set before us have been very helpful for me. If you've ever attended one of my classes up in there, you might have seen or heard of this analogy. The first metaphor or analogy would be the image of the photo mosaic, right? So at the end of the history of the making of the Bible, we looked at multiple pictures. I showed you a zoom in of some pictures, right? Well, there's like a bird or a penguin or things like that, right? You've seen those kinds of photos before. It should be in your notes, where it's a bunch of little pictures, right? When they're put next to each other, they make up of this photo, this image is made up of hundreds of tiny or thousands of tiny little photographs. And so if you ever Google the word photo mosaic, somewhere on the first or second page, there's going to be a website of a guy named Robert Silvers, who claims to have invented the photo mosaic. I don't know if that's true, but he claims to have, right? And he's got a cool website, and he's a photographer, and he talks about how he came up with photo mosaics, right? And why he thinks he invented it, right? That's his claim, right? What's cool about the way he talks about it is how he put them together. He says he has lots of samples from throughout his decades of work, and he has one whole section that's just portraits of famous historical characters. And I have a strong interest in the history of jazz. I like jazz music, right? And so he does Louis Armstrong, right? And he's a trumpet player, right? And so he's known as one of the sage masters of jazz trumpet. And the one in your notes is a photo mosaic of Louis Armstrong. It's made up of hundreds of little photos taken from recording sessions of Louis Armstrong, right? So the larger picture is Louis Armstrong's face, right? But each individual panel is stories from his life put together to make Louis Armstrong, right? And so there's, even right there, a photo of someone, right, made up of photos of the thing that they were, which was a famous, virtuosic trumpet player, doing that for the whole of their career, right? Right there, that image already communicates something, that it's these little moments that make up Louis Armstrong, right? That's the claim. Right? It's these little recording sessions. It's the people who are not Louis Armstrong, who he played with, that make Louis Armstrong Louis Armstrong. Right? If Louis Armstrong didn't have a backing band, it would have just been a trumpet. Right? Louis Armstrong would not have become who he was. Right? If it wasn't for Ella Fitzgerald, right? If it wasn't for all these other people who had sessioned with him, right? That's the technique right there. It's this little simple thing is communicating something. The image on the left, is it a unified portrait of Louis Armstrong? Meaning, like, can you tell it's Louis Armstrong? Yeah, you can tell it's Louis Armstrong. Yeah, the big picture, you can tell it's Louis Armstrong. But is it Louis Armstrong? No, it's actually thousands of pictures of Louis Armstrong and his friends arranged to look like Louis Armstrong in such a way that when they're put together in that way, that's Louis Armstrong, right? But that's not a picture of Louis Armstrong, right? It's actually a collection of pictures of Louis Armstrong, right? So you can see him, and what your mind is doing is making sense of the pattern, right? If you zoomed in, would you if you zoomed into 50 of those photos, would you be able to say that this is Louis Armstrong? No. It's when you zoom out that you can say, that's Louis Armstrong, right? You might be able to pick out Louis Armstrong in one of the photos, but you wouldn't know that all the 50 photos together is the cheek, right? This is the thing. What our mind is doing is that thing that Adele Berlin in a session ago was talking about, that your mind is actually creating order out of the gaps, out of the complexity of images, and filling in so that you can see the detail of a cheek from a bird's eye view, right? Or the shape of an upper lip. Even though if you zoom in real close, you won't be able to see it, right? It's a complex photo. Each little one is a complex photo with its own compositions, right? In many ways, that analogy of the photo mosaic has been such a helpful way for me to think about the way that the Hebrew Bible is set up, right? The Hebrew Bible, and the big picture is the Tanakh. It's the story of how God doesn't give up on the people and how he's going to continue to participate in their redemption, of being put back on track, right? But each little story, I don't get that right away, right? Only when I understand how each one connects to each other do I ever fill out that picture, right? So if we're only ever reading certain sections of Genesis, certain sections of Exodus, and we never touch Leviticus, and then we barely get Numbers, and then Deuteronomy when we have to, we've already missed a huge section of how the whole story works, right? And so that's how the Hebrew Bible works. It's somewhat similar to the quilt analogy, right? That each section of the quilt is from different places, but when you sew them together, they each have their own story, but together you have the story of how the quilt came together, right? For me, what's helpful is to think about this technique involved in creating patterns. That's huge for us. Patterns, right? Right? Because what we see in that photo mosaic is simply pattern making. Somebody made a complex pattern. They took thousands of photos of Louis Armstrong and knit them together in such a way that when you look at all of the thousands of photos, you think Louis Armstrong, right? You don't even have to look at each individual picture yet to see that it's Louis Armstrong. Do you see that? That's the beauty of the pattern making. It becomes complex when you see, oh, each picture is Louis Armstrong. You can ask, is there an order to how the photos are organized? That's a more complex question that will take a longer time to figure out, right? What if they were doing all of the sessions were at the top, right? And they put all the no's. It's all the sessions where they were in a smoke-filled room because Louis Armstrong he heavily used marijuana, right? We don't, at this level, at the level of that's Louis Armstrong, I don't know how they organized it, right? You see how it gets complex really quickly, right? Just asking, how did the author organize it, right? Already tells you a little bit about who's organizing. So this thing is creating patterns of meaning on a macro level so that you can see, oh, all together it's Louis Armstrong, and then building little blocks that in themselves are their own complex patterns with their own meanings to them. And these images are mostly cast with dark black background and then a lit person in the front, right? That's how these images are typically set up, right? You could say that it's a pattern of light and composition of light, right? Each one of these pictures is like, that's how you shade in, that's how you shade in the cheek of Louis Armstrong, right? Darker pictures form the shadows, right? And lighter pictures, right? It's all play on light, right? And these have been grouped together because of their similarity and their differences. When you put the similar things together, it forms an idea. But when you put separate things together, it also forms an idea. Black and white put together makes shadow and composition and definition, right? That's how the Hebrew Bible works. It's the contrasts and the similarities put together that are trying to communicate something on a deeper level than let there be light, right? Let there be light itself is a function next to the parallels, the chiasms, the story of Exodus, the story of Moses, the story at the end of the Bible, right? Where the tree of life shows up again in Revelation, right? So that's how it works. And so back to our discussion from times past, the story of Jonah, when Jesus mentions the story of Jonah, he's activating one little photo, right? That's itself a part of a whole network of ideas, of similarly shaped photos, right? Because there's also the sense of dry land being brought through the waters, dry land appearing, right? It's a retelling of Moses, right? It's instead of the ark that brings Moses to safely, it's the belly of this giant fish, right? Similar but different, same ideas. For what? Those are the questions that we need to continue to ask, right? And when Jesus and the apostles, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they do this all the time. They'll use one moment from the Hebrew Bible to activate all the little images, right? What they assume is you know who Jonah is, and you've read the Tanakh before, so you know all the times where Jonah was referencing all these things. So if you click Jonah, if you click Jesus is talking about the sign of Jonah, you click it, here's all the Jonah stories, the book of Jonah. And when you click the book of Jonah, there's all these little things that Jonah itself is referencing, right? You see how the logic of that works? It's like following a Wikipedia page, right? And there's all these ones. And sometimes if I spend 2 hours, I can get maybe through the first 10 links, right? But then there's still a lot of links to click on, right? And so they assume you know Jonah, and there you go. There's nothing for it but to get familiar with all the other stories, right? And you won't get it until you get familiar with all the other stories. That's how the Hebrew Bible works. That's the last skill. This last skill I want us to focus on is understanding patterns and seeing them, right? Because what we've done is developed all of the tools to see setting, repetition, parallelism, characters, plot, all these things. But put together in patterns, that's how you get to read Hebrew Bible, is identifying patterns, right? So the last skill I want us to focus on is identifying patterns, right? How do I learn to read this way of the Hebrew Bible? What are the tools that biblical authors are employing to network, pattern, and group all of these ideas, these different stories and poems and so on? That's one image. The second analogy to get this reading skill set on the table would be the way that a film that is hours and hours long creates a plot line that's cohesive, right? That makes sense. So when it comes to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, people have very, very strong opinions on how well Peter Jackson did the books, right? And I'm just using the films based on the fact that a lot of people have seen the films. So if you've ever, I did a lesson on Halloween once where we talked about the pictures of the idea of spirits and demons throughout the biblical text. And then I open with this story. So you might have already seen this. But in the Lord of the Rings, we have a complex, large world, right? It's a narrative world. Tell me some things about Lord of the Rings. Who's seen it? Yeah, so we've seen it. We've seen Lord of the Rings. Tell me some things about the world of Lord of the Rings. Just some things, just observations. There's not like right or wrong answers here. There's kings and kingdoms. There's kings and kingdoms, and there's ancient kings and kingdoms, right? The Lord of the Rings world is a world that has seen a lot of time. We're told that this is the third age, right? The third age, right? Which means that there were 2 ages before, right? And they play on that all the time. Things have passed into memory. That's the ring, right? The ring happened in what? The first age, right? The ring happened in the first age and then was lost. And all the kings of men forgot about it, right? And until Hobbit, the most curious of creatures, finds it, right? And so you have that already. The world of Lord of the Rings is a long narrative world. The setting is the third age. Magic is fading, right? Sauron is on the rise. The grumblings from Mordor are on the rise, right? So you have a large, complex world that has history. It has a logic. There's magic, right? What magic is possible, what magic is impossible. The characters are different. There's humans, there's elves, right? And they all represent different things. Ea, right? This is the Silmarillion. And then how all of the different composers in the Iluvatar's choir sang. And their songs brought to life all kinds of things. But then one particular composer fancied his composition above the rest. And what he did is he played discordant chords. And through the discord arose many different other things that have life through the discord. and how the Iluvatar is weaving all of the songs and all of even the discord into his final movement, right? That's the religious background of Lord of the Rings. It's crazy. And you don't even read about it in Lord of the Rings, the 3 books. It's just assumed you know it, right? That's how Tolkien wrote. The Silmarillion, if you want to know what their religious order was, it's that book. And it's all assumed at that point when you get to Lord of the Rings, right? In fact, Lord of the Rings is actually not even written as a story. It's written as a translation of a book that one of the characters wrote, right? And then the author of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, will always say, this is actually Sam's edit because I couldn't read Bilbo's handwriting here. So it's a crazy world, right? So when we're talking about complex narratives, Tolkien is one, right? And so people complain about the movies because of course they would, because they wanted to do justice to this insane text. But if you watched the movie, it made sense to you, right? That's all that matters, is that you could follow, right? But when you experience something like that, in one sense, all it is a series of clips woven together by a score, right? And the clips are just put next to each other, and you have to have continuity. If you've ever seen a really poorly made movie where it's poorly edited, it's hard to follow, right? That's why people don't like hard to follow movies, because it doesn't make any sense. But to have 3 hours of continuous clip, and it makes sense to you, your mind is doing a lot of filling in gaps, right? And so when you experience the whole thing as a whole, you understood it, right? What's the main thing that threads all of the different characters and clips together in the story of Lord of the Rings as a movie? What's weaving it together? What's helping you put together all of the gaps? Right? It's just like Aslan in Narnia, right? The lion in Narnia, that's the thing that weaves it all together. In Lord of the Rings, it's the ring. The ring is the central character of Lord of the Rings, and everybody just responds to the ring, right? The conflict is that the ring exists, and its very existence is a danger, right? And everybody thinks of the ring differently. How did Boromir think of the ring? It's just a tool. Why can't we use it? The enemies want to kill us. They're going to use the ring to kill us, so why don't we use it? What does Gimli think about it? It's just a ring. My family has always mined the depths. Why can't we just destroy it, right? What does Gandalf think of the ring? It's a danger. I can't touch it. If I touch it, then the ring gets access to the most powerful, right? So nobody understands this ring. One of the very early stories of the ring in Lord of the Rings is that it's gifted to Frodo. It's just gifted to him. It's just a ring to Bilbo, and he kept it secret. It had a hold on him, but we never really knew what the ring was. And then when it's gifted to Frodo, Gandalf sees it. What does Gandalf think of the ring? No, at that point, Gandalf doesn't know what the ring is. He says, "How long have you had that?" "Oh, I found it in a cave." "Oh, okay." It's just a ring to Gandalf, right? But then when he sees that he can't leave it to Frodo, he says, "I don't know what this ring is." And so what does he do? He actually goes to see Saruman, and he researches the ring. For actually in the books, it's like 2 years, because he couldn't find it. It's lost to history. And so Gandalf is studying the ring. And so Frodo just has the ring on the mantle for 2 years. Meanwhile, Sauron, the world is growing. We don't know that Saruman his mind is already soured, right? Because he's afraid of Mordor, right? And Saruman isn't even evil. He's just afraid of Mordor, and he thinks eventually Sauron will win, so if I can't beat him, join him, right? So he's a tragic figure. And so when Gandalf comes back to Frodo, does he know that that's the ring of power? He doesn't. He read that it glows in the fire sometimes. And he just read, he's not sure. And so he has Frodo put it, and then he takes the ring out, and Gandalf is relieved because it's not glowing. Except, a few minutes later, it begins to glow, and it's cool to the touch, and it shapes to Frodo's hand, right? And it's the black speech of Mordor. And that's when Gandalf knows it's the ring. It's the ring of power that nobody even knew existed. Right? So that's the whole tension of Lord of the Rings. This ring has bound together the first, second, and third ages all in one. And it's culminating here. So actually, the Lord of the Rings is the very end of the story of the ring. It's not the beginning, right? It's just the last chunk about it's the make it or break it moment of the ring, right? And the ring has to be dealt with. It must be destroyed. However, the ring has powers that will corrupt and destroy. And one of the most repeated motifs in the ring, in the Lord of the Rings movie, is looking at the ring in the palm of a hand. That's the shot after shot after shot. It's in somebody's palm, right? Take it from me, Gandalf, right? Or I'll take the ring, but I don't know the way, right? So many moments where the ring is in front of the character and the character has to respond. That's a motif, right? And then when you hear, that means this, and the song is called The Pity of Smeagol. So it's actually, the song is cueing you into, this is a tragic moment. What will happen when they get challenged with the ring, right? And so our mind is saying, oh, this is the moment that somebody's going to have to decide what they're going to do with the ring. It's woven into the music, it's woven into the way the shot is framed, and it's woven into the story, right? And so this is, if you look at the pictures here, I think I have the collection of those images, right? And so it's not even the picture of the ring, it's the reaction, it's the initial face of the person who's challenged with the ring, right? It's not the order that this appears in the movie, but so you have Smeagol on the upper left. So this is Gollum before he becomes Gollum. So this is the first time Gollum has the ring, right? And then you have Smeagol on the right, who is on the upper left. Who is consumed and destroyed by the ring. And ironically, the first one who is consumed and destroyed by the ring is what? The one who will destroy the ring in the end, right? We think it's Frodo the whole time. Sorry, if you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to spoil it. Smeagol is the one who falls in by pure accident, right? Nobody chose to destroy the ring, right? Ultimately, the first person to be consumed is the person who goes down with the ring, right? But while destroying himself at the same time, right? So he destroys the ring, but he's consumed also in the process. It's as if Smeagol, who becomes Gollum, his narrative and his storyline with the ring becomes the paradigm for what could happen, right? That's why they show you Gollum and Smeagol. Is that Smeagol was Smeagol at one point, and he's still there inside. But they're fighting. There's a war waging within Smeagol, and Gollum is the one who takes over, right? And he becomes the paradigm. Any one of these people could become Gollum, right? And the whole narrative world, if it gets into the wrong hands, it will consume you, and you will be destroyed by it, right? So there's that. Does every character repeat what happens to Smeagol? No, right? That's what the other images are, right? There's a diversity of responses to the temptation of the ring. Bilbo, for example. Is he harmed by the ring's tempting powers? Yeah. He's harmed by it, but not in a way that's most obvious to us. Because Frodo had no idea, and neither did Gandalf, right? Gandalf didn't even know. But Gandalf had an inkling. What was Gandalf's thing? How did he figure? What was the doubt in Gandalf's mind? No. How did Gandalf get suspicious of Bilbo? Before that, though, he says something. It's really small.
Precious.
No, way before this. It's a small guy. It's a small little aside that if you don't notice it, you'll miss it. It's why Bilbo says, "I feel like butter spread over too much bread." Right? That's what he says. There's a little bit of butter, and there's a lot of bread, and then if you spread that butter across all of the bread, it's not enough butter. It's because Bilbo's old. He's too old for a hobbit, right? And that 111th birthday, right? That's what he says, right? Too old for a hobbit, and he's normal. And Gandalf is like, wow, you're kind of old. You don't look a day over 30 is what he says, right? And so it's too old, too long. Hobbits don't live like this, right? So there's an unnatural length. And Bilbo looks fine, but he feels too thin, too little of a human at this point, right? That's the thing. So Bilbo is harmed by the ring, but we don't see it right away, right? It wrecks him as a character, right? He's too old, he's too tired. And what's it kept him from? Traveling. He's always wanted to travel, but he never left for fear of losing the ring, right? He's never the same once it gets into his hands. He looks the same, but he's changed. He's more isolated. The whole building is no close friends or relations, nobody. It's his birthday, but he doesn't want any family, right? He's become a crotchety old man. If you read The Hobbit, he had a larder full of food. He's inviting all these people, right? He's friendly, right? He actually invites all of the 12 dwarves who clean out his larder, and they become his best friends. So the ring has changed him. But ultimately, is he able to part with it? In the end, right? But not on his own. Pressure, right? Pressure from Gandalf. Guilt from Frodo, right? It's a similar motif. Something happened to Gollum. Something happened to Bilbo, right? Think back to the biblical poetry. The parallel lines. They're similar, but different, right? It's actually the similarity that makes you compare the two characters. They're both hobbits. They both receive the ring. One is the former owner. One is the current owner. But it's the difference that begins to create the meaning and the ethical and the moral meaning of the story, right? This one drove Smeagol to murder, right? He killed his best friend Deagle, right? But then for Bilbo, he won it in a contest, a ring contest. But he lied to get it, right? He told a trick question that nobody could answer. What have I got in my pocket, right? It's impossible. It's not a riddle, right? And so that's how they get him, right? And so that begins to create the similarities, and the differences begin to create some of the meaning. When Gandalf is offered the ring, what happens? He got a mix of anger and fear, and he was overwhelmed, right? Yeah, don't tempt me, Frodo. I don't even want to use it, even for good, right? And he offers the ring, but he resists it, and it puts the fear of God into to Frodo. It also puts the fear of God into Bilbo, right? Like, Bilbo Baggins, I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm trying to help you, right? And then Bilbo is in fetal position by the end of that story, right? But in that moment, if you watch the movie, you see Gandalf motion to it, and then you hear the pity of Smeagol. He's just barely able to resist it, right? Just barely, right? If he had taken it, the story's over, right? Sauron won, right? So it's all these near misses, right? He's just barely able to resist it, and then he becomes filled with his own fear because he's afraid that the potential that it would have in his hands to ruin everyone around him, right? You have this, and then you have an arrogant human king, Boromir, right? Who gives into the ring, and then it's taken from him, right? Isildur, right? Isildur takes the ring, and he's an arrogant king, right? And he doesn't throw it in the fires of Mount Doom. He takes it for himself, right? But the next scene, he's dead, right? It's a short version of Smeagol's story, right? A good example of the strategy is, instead of the narrator coming in and saying, the ring is bad, don't use it. Instead, they're showing you what the ring does, how the ring affects people. Because it's one thing to say that the ring is bad, and then you're just like Adam and Eve in the garden. Really though? Is it that bad? But then you see what it does, right? And it just wreaks havoc, right? And the ring gets into Isildur's hands, and he dies in the next scene. It's very clear that the storyteller is trying to do something here. When Galadriel is offered the ring, right? Galadriel is the lady of the forest. When she is offered the ring, what happens? She freaks out like Gandalf, but differently than Gandalf. She actually becomes the witch of the wood, right? She becomes this glowing, because Galadriel is the most powerful being in Middle-earth, actually. She's the most powerful of the servants of Iluvatar. And she becomes the terrifying queen of death. She's green and bright, and her voice is like a mighty waters, right? And she lights up, and she actually gives a prophecy, right? She becomes channeled by something else, and then she fades out, And if you see in the movie, she's shaken, right? And she's happy she passed the test, because in that moment, if she had taken it, it's really over for everyone, right? And she's a little terrified, and she says, "No, I can't take it." And then you have to leave tomorrow. You cannot be here with me, right? And so there's only one character who brushes off the ring completely. Who is that? The Strider, right? The one who will become king. It's the secret king who has also a long life, but not because he takes the ring, right? If you don't know this, Aragorn is a son of the Numenor, which means he has a long, long life. He's almost as old as Legolas, but we don't know that. He's human. And he lives this very long life, but not because of the ring, but because it's in his blood to do so, right? And he's a strider, he's a ranger, which means that he just patrols the edges of Mordor, keeping it at bay. And eventually he has to care. He has to care about finding the ring and taking up his birthright, right? He's the one who sees the ring and just closes Frodo's hand, right? Keep it, right? And he doesn't even chase the ring. Right? When Frodo leaves with a ring, he doesn't chase the ring. Where does he go instead? Just do a regular good thing, which is find other lost hobbits. Right? He's actually not the reason why the ring gets to Mount Doom. Right? It just happens. Right? And Aragorn is just concerned with doing the good, right thing where he is. Right? And so there's just this wonderful inversion. And so this is where we'll go in the next few sections, is that we'll look at how this kind of pattern inversion and pattern making and motif shows up in Scripture. We've seen that in the river. We've seen that in the prophet. We've seen that in the king, right? There's all these different motifs that repeat and invert themselves. So like there's the flight from Egypt, where the Israelites are leaving Egypt from a oppressive Pharaoh. But then you have the inversion of that in the Jesus story, where they're fleeing to Egypt to escape the oppressive king of Jerusalem, right, of Judah, right? So these are what we'll look at in the next, right? So honing the skill of taking everything that we've learned and finding patterns. This is the challenge for the weeks to come. And then we'll close. Any questions before we leave? None? I will close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you once again for the opportunity to study your word and to dig into the nitty-gritty of the text, and to practice and put together all the things that we've studied and learned and synthesize them into better reading of your text, Lord, of your word, that we might understand what you're up to in the world better. Lord, thank you for this. In your name we pray. Amen.